Alright, so today's lesson is going to be all about simplifying radicals. Alright, so the very first thing that we should know when we're simplifying a radical is what is a radical. So let me just write out an example of a radical. So we have a little square or a little root sign there. Then underneath we have a number. Let's just call that number A. And in front we have another number. Let's just call that number B. And then let's put a little number in here and call that N. Okay? So we need to know a definition of all these little numbers. So this N here is called the index. The A value is called the radicand. Okay, and the B value is called the coefficient. Alright, so it's important to understand the definitions of those little numbers there. So when we describe what simplifying radicals is, and I say coefficient, you know that the coefficient just means the number in front of the radical symbol. Alright, so I'm going to do this question. I'm going to give you an example here. So let's say that I have the square root of 18. And let's say that we are trying to simplify this radical. And by simplifying, I mean that you're converting it from an entire radical to a mixed. And so an entire radical is something that has a coefficient of basically 1. So that would be this type of radical where you have a number in front here. It's just a 1. So there's no number there, but it's a 1. It's assumed that it's a 1. And a mixed radical is the coefficient is not 1. Alright, so we need to convert this coefficient to be maybe a 2, a 3, a 4, or something like that. So we're trying to break down this radical, this square root 18. So the first step that you would want to do for any of these questions here is write down all your perfect squares, because our perfect squares are going to help us a lot with this. So we write down all our perfect squares. So 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, dot, dot, dot. And I just like to write down up to 7. You could write up to 8 or 9, but basically 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's going to help you out when simplifying these radicals is to know a radical rule that if you're taking the square root of A multiplied by B under the radical sign, that's basically equal to the square root of A times the square root of B. And so basically we could test that, and you could say, well, you know, if I don't believe you, that, well, the square root of 4 times the square root of 9 should equal the square root of 4 multiplied by the square root of 9. Okay, so the square root of 4 is 2 and the square root of 9 is 3, because remember that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that's 3, which should equal 6. Okay, well, let's test that. The square root of 4 times 9. So the square root of, well, 4 times 9 is 36. Well, what is the square root of 36? It's 6. So we know that they're the same thing, so we can come up with an identity or a rule, and we know that the square root of any two numbers multiplied underneath a radical sign should equal the radical of A times the radical of B. Alright, the two numbers. Okay, so we're going to use that rule when we're simplifying radicals. So when we're simplifying the square root of 18, you need to think of two numbers that we can break this up into. So we know that this should be the square root of something multiplied by something else. Alright, so we're using this rule and we're splitting up that 18 into two numbers that multiply together to give us 18. Now it's going to be really important that one of those numbers, either this one or that one, is a perfect square. Okay, it has to be a perfect square. Alright, one of these numbers has to be a perfect square. So if you might think in your head, what two numbers multiply to give me 18, and one of those numbers is a perfect square. So I'm looking here, okay, 18, 9. Alright, 9 multiplied by 2 is good. So 9 multiplied by 2. So 9 multiplied by 2 gives us 18, and we know that 9 is a perfect square. So that's what's going to make this possible. So now we use our rule that we said that the square root of A times B is A square root of A multiplied by the square root of B. So that would be the square root of 9 multiplied by the square root of 2. but you know what the square root of 9 is. You know that the square root of 9 is 3. So it's 3 multiplied by root 2, so 3 square root 2. And now if you look at this, you have a coefficient of 3, so therefore it's a mixed radical and not an entire radical. So that's what simplifying radicals is all about, is reducing an entire radical into a mixed radical by using this identity here. All right, let me give you one more example of how you might simplify a radical. Maybe we could try a different radical that's a little less, or a little more difficult. So let's try this one here. So let's say that I have, let's go 2 square root 72. All right, let's try to simplify that radical, and it is kind of a mixed radical here, and it's because you have a coefficient of 2 here and a radical of 72. So you have a coefficient of 2, so it is technically a mixed radical. So that's fine, but we can reduce this. We can simplify this even further. Because if I write down all my perfect squares, so 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, and we keep going, 7 squared is 49, 8 squared, 64, 9 squared, 81. Okay, so we look on here and we know that 36 multiplied by 2 does give us 72. So again, we use that same rule, and you split that up to be the square root of 36 multiplied by 2, and we keep the 2 up front here. The 2 carries down right there, and remember, these are multiplied, okay? And so now we split it up again, so 2 times square root 36 times square root 2. So you're breaking that up again, and we know that's okay to do that because of the rule that we did here. We said the square root of a multiplied by b is equal to the square root of a multiplied by square root b. Okay, so then we can reduce that a little bit, because 2 multiplied by, and then square root 36, what is that? That's 6 multiplied by square root 2. And 2 multiplied by 6 is 12, so it's 12 square root 2. Alright, so that's your final answer. That would be the most simplest form. So we reduce that square root of 72, which is a big number, down to square root 2 by using our knowledge of the identity up here that helps us simplify radicals. Alright, so that's how you simplify radicals.